They say God never speaks to the damned, that when heaven casts you out, your name is erased, your voice forgotten, your memory lost to silence. But there was a day, a single haunting day, when that silence shattered. A day when the Creator of all things, the same voice that spoke light into the void, spoke once more, not to a prophet, not to a saint, but to a fallen angel. Imagine that. The voice of God calling out to one he had once loved, not in wrath, but in remembrance, not to destroy, but to remind. The day heaven broke its silence was not marked by thunder or flame, but by sorrow. Because even in judgment, God remembers mercy, and even in punishment, he remembers love. They say hell echoes with screams, but on that day even the fallen grew quiet, because heaven had spoken, and every word carried the weight of eternity. This is that story, the day God spoke to a demon, the day heaven remembered the fallen. Before we begin, welcome to Bible Mysteries. If you love stories that challenge your spirit and stir your soul, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the bell icon, because today's story will change how you see heaven, hell, and everything in between. Before the first drop of rain ever touched the ground, before Noah's Ark, before the flood, before the commandments were carved in stone, there was harmony. Heaven was perfect, a kingdom of endless light, where time did not exist and every being radiated with purpose. Angels sang, not because they had to, but because worship was their very breath. Every note, every sound was a language of love, pure, eternal, and unbroken. But even in perfection, something began to stir. A quiet whisper that would change the balance of heaven forever. Among the countless angels, there were those who were not confined to heaven's gates. They were called the Watchers, divine sentinels assigned to guard humanity in its infancy. Their task was simple: to observe, to protect, and to report back to heaven. Never to interfere, never to touch. At first they obeyed. They watched mankind grow, learning, laughing, building fires, forming families. They watched the first tears ever fall, the first prayers ever whispered, the first songs ever sung to the unseen God. And slowly they began to feel something they were never created to feel: compassion, curiosity. And then, something more dangerous: desire. They saw the beauty of human life, fragile yet fearless, broken yet still reaching toward heaven. And they wanted to understand it. They began to envy the way humans loved, the way men and women held each other through pain, the way they cried, the way they laughed, the way they chose to love even when it hurt. To the Watchers, that freedom was intoxicating. For in heaven, love was perfect, but it was commanded. On earth, love was flawed, but it was real. And that difference changed everything. Curiosity turned to longing, longing turned to rebellion, and rebellion turned to a decision that would scar both heaven and earth. 200 angels gathered upon Mount Hermon, a mountain so high it pierced the clouds. There, under a sky full of silent stars, they made a pact, a vow that none of them would ever return alone. If one fell, they would all fall together. They would descend to the earth, take wives among humans, and share with mankind the knowledge of heaven, secrets meant only for the divine. They called it love, but heaven called it treason, and so they fell. The night they descended, the heavens trembled. Fire streaked across the sky like lightning made of sorrow. The world below believed gods had come to dwell among men, beautiful beings with faces like light and voices like thunder. They taught mankind things never meant to be known: how to forge weapons from the earth, how to summon spirits from the void, how to twist beauty into vanity and knowledge into power. They built cities, raised monuments, and crowned themselves kings among men. And from their union with human women came children, the Nephilim, the giants of old. They were mighty, beautiful, and merciless. They ruled with cruelty, enslaving those weaker than them, crushing nations before they even began. Blood filled the earth. Corruption spread like fire through the veins of creation. The ground cried out, the oceans roared, and heaven, for the first time, fell silent. But God was not absent. He was watching, not with anger at first, but with heartbreak, because these fallen ones were not strangers. They were his children. He had formed them in glory, breathed his light into them, called them sons of God. And now they had become shadows of what they once were. Still, mercy lingered. God did not strike them down. Instead, he sent a messenger, not an angel, not a warrior, but a man whose heart still beat in rhythm with heaven. His name was Enoch. Enoch was unlike the rest of mankind. He lived in a world that had forgotten God, yet somehow he still walked with him, not once a week, not once a month, every day, every breath. When others built altars to idols, Enoch built silence, a place where heaven and earth could still meet. And because of that purity, God chose him to carry a message that would make even angels tremble. One night, as the stars burned quietly above, the air changed. The veil between worlds grew thin, and before Enoch could even speak, a light unlike any other consumed him. He was taken, body and spirit, into the heights of heaven. There, surrounded by living fire and the roar of countless wings, the voice of the Almighty spoke. Enoch, messenger of the earth, go to the watchers who have left their high places. Tell them they will have no peace. Tell them their intercession is denied. Tell them they were made to dwell in heaven, not among flesh and dust. Enoch's heart trembled. To deliver a message to the fallen was no blessing. It was a burden. But obedience was heavier than fear, and so he bowed and returned to the world below. He found the watchers in shadows, their brilliance dimmed, their wings torn by the weight of sin. Their faces no longer shone with light, but with regret. When they saw Enoch, they fell before him, pleading, Enoch, righteous one, intercede for us. Speak to the Almighty on our behalf. Tell him we are sorry. Tell him we will return. And for a brief moment, Enoch saw not monsters, but broken beings, crying for a forgiveness they no longer deserved. Their voices were heavy with sorrow. Their eyes, once brighter than stars, were dim with pain. He promised to carry their plea back to heaven. He promised to speak for them. But when he returned to the throne, what he heard would silence even the fallen. When Enoch was taken into the heights once more, he did not rise as a man chasing revelation. He rose as a witness burdened with sorrow. He carried the grief of beings who once lived in eternal light and had now become shadows of what they were. Between heaven and earth, he stood as the bridge no one else could cross, the only voice left to speak between judgment and memory. Heaven had known rebellion before, but the fall of the Watchers was unlike the defiance of Lucifer. This was not born from pride, but from desire, not from hatred of God, but from yearning for something they were never meant to touch. They had loved what was mortal, and in loving it, they had betrayed what was immortal. Their descent had corrupted creation itself. The knowledge they brought to mankind was not the wisdom of heaven, but fragments of glory broken by sin. They revealed secrets meant for eternity to hearts unready for them, forging weapons, summoning spirits, bending the gifts of creation into instruments of blood and vanity. And with each generation, humanity grew more distant from the innocence it once had. The once living harmony between heaven and earth became polluted by greed, war, and lust for power. And the Watchers, who had meant to enlighten, had darkened the very world they loved. Now they wept not only for their punishment, but for the ruin of the creation they tried to protect. When Enoch entered the heavenly realm, all creation paused, for no man before him had carried the cries of angels. He moved through layers of light, through realms where eternity itself breathed, until he came to the place where holiness has no shadow. And there, in that place of endless radiance, he stood before the presence of the Almighty. But heaven's response did not come as thunder. It came as a stillness so vast it silenced even thought. For what could be said of those who once stood beside the throne and now beg for entry through the gates of judgment? In the ancient writings, it is recorded that their plea was not denied from wrath, but from the nature of what they had become. They were no longer creatures of spirit. They had joined themselves to the dust, and dust cannot dwell in the brightness of glory. Their nature had been altered beyond restoration. They had seen the face of God, yet turned away willingly. They had known the perfection of his presence, yet chose the imperfection of desire. Their decision had woven corruption into their being, and mercy could not undo what rebellion had reshaped. The weight of that truth echoed through the heavens like a lament. Because God's justice is never separate from his heart, and even in condemnation, there is sorrow. The fall of the Watchers was not just the loss of angels, it was the breaking of a family once whole. They had been sons of the dawn, bearers of divine flame, entrusted with the guardianship of worlds, and now they would be bound to caverns beneath the mountains, chained in darkness until the final reckoning. The Watchers were not destroyed, but imprisoned, not erased, but silenced. Their voices that once sang praises now murmured through the depths of the earth, crying for a forgiveness that would never be spoken. Their children, the Nephilim, born of forbidden union, would perish in the flood, swept away so that humanity might begin again uncorrupted. And yet, even as judgment was sealed, the story did not end in hatred. For the text suggests something deeper, that within the sorrow of heaven, remembrance remained, because love once given does not die. Even in wrath, God's memory lingered over those who fell. He did not forget the songs they once sang, the beauty they once reflected, the loyalty they once held. But justice had to stand, for to erase judgment would be to erase holiness itself, and holiness cannot deny its own truth. The heavens mourned their loss in silence. The stars, ancient witnesses of creation, seemed to dim in remembrance of the ones who once danced among them. The angels who remained pure did not rejoice, because in heaven victory over rebellion brings no joy, only grief for what was lost. Enoch descended again, carrying the answer not as a decree but as a weight upon his soul. He returned to a world already trembling beneath the corruption the Watchers had sown. When he reached the place of their exile, the fallen ones saw him coming, but before he could speak, they already knew. They felt it in the stillness of the air. They saw it in the silence of his face. And in that moment, the truth broke them more than chains ever could. They had prayed for mercy, but what they received was remembrance. Heaven had remembered them, not to restore, but to warn. Their story would echo through generations as proof that love without obedience becomes ruin and desire without restraint becomes death. Their fall would become the lesson that even divine beings cannot escape the consequence of choice. And so their cries faded into the hollow places of the earth, echoing beneath every mountain and whispering through every shadowed valley. The world above moved on. The flood would come. The children of men would forget their names, but heaven never did. Their memory lived in the sorrow of God, a sorrow that still burns quietly at the edges of eternity, the kind of sorrow that remembers what was once beautiful and what it became. After the Watchers were condemned, silence returned to heaven. Not the silence of peace, but of grief, the kind of stillness that follows after something sacred has been broken. For even in a realm of perfection, loss had found a way to exist. The fall of the Watchers was not a moment forgotten. It was carved into the memory of creation itself, a scar across eternity, reminding heaven of what love could cost when it was misused. And though God had spoken judgment, his remembrance of them never faded. In the language of men, remembrance often means nostalgia. But in the language of heaven, remembrance is a living thing. It is not simply recalling what was lost, but holding it within eternity as a lesson, a mark, a truth. And so, the memory of the fallen lingered, not in rage, but in divine sorrow. The angels who remained pure felt it too. They had once called the Watchers brothers. They had sung together, served together, created together. Now their names were whispered like morning hymns through the halls of light. Every time the morning stars rose, the void where their voices should have been echoed in silence. Heaven remembered them not because they deserved it, but because love had once been shared. For even when a son turns away, a father still remembers the day he was born. That is the kind of remembrance heaven held. And from that remembrance came understanding, not for the fallen angels, but for humanity. Because when the sons of heaven fell, the earth bore their curse. Mankind suffered because of a rebellion they did not commit. And yet in their frailty, God saw something the angels had lost: repentance. Humans, though bound to flesh and error, could still return. They could still choose to seek him again. And so the memory of the angels who could not be redeemed became the reason why redemption was offered to man. It was as if heaven said, "Let this never happen again. Let not creation perish without a way back home." And from that decision, mercy began to take shape, not as an afterthought, but as a divine resolve. Because the loss of the watchers revealed what eternity without grace looks like. It showed heaven what happens when perfection falls without a path to return. So when the flood came, it was not only judgment, it was cleansing. It was God pressing reset on a world corrupted by angelic pride and human ambition. But after the waters receded and the earth was new again, a covenant was formed. A promise that judgment would never again destroy all life. A sign that mercy had entered history. That mercy did not erase the memory of the fallen, it was born from it. For every act of divine compassion that followed, from Abraham's covenant to Moses' law to the birth of Christ, carried the shadow of that early rebellion. Heaven had learned what it meant to lose, and in that loss, it found a reason to save. When the Son of God later walked the earth, that same remembrance echoed in his words. He spoke of forgiveness, not because sin was small, but because he knew what unredeemed loss looked like. He had seen it once, in the angels who could never rise again. Every miracle he performed, every parable he told, every time he reached for a soul that had fallen, it was heaven remembering. It was the divine heart saying, "This time, none shall be beyond redemption." And so the tragedy of the watchers became the seed of salvation. Their fall became the reason grace was born. For what heaven lost in them, it vowed never to lose again. Even now their memory endures, not in heaven's glory, but in its mercy. Their names are no longer spoken among the angels, yet their story echoes in every act of compassion, every second chance, every prayer whispered by the broken. Because before God ever spoke to a demon, he had already remembered what it meant to love one. That remembrance is the thread that runs through all of time, from the first rebellion to the final redemption. It is the unspoken truth of creation, that love once given by God can never fully die, even when it must let go. And though the watchers remain bound, their legacy became the mirror through which heaven sees humanity. Fragile, flawed, and yet still capable of turning back toward the light. Heaven remembered them, and because it did, mercy was born. Deep beneath the ruins of a world reshaped by judgment, a whisper stirred where light had long ceased to reach. In the abyss where the watchers were bound, there existed no sound, no passage of time, only the endless weight of memory. Chains forged by divine decree held them, and their names became dust upon the lips of eternity. Yet somewhere in that eternal silence, a single awareness endured. Not a name, not a voice, only consciousness, flickering like a dying ember. One of the fallen still remembered what light felt like. Not its warmth, but its weight, the unbearable purity that once clothed him before pride became his garment. And then, for the first time since heaven closed its gates upon him, he heard something impossible, a sound that did not belong to the pit, a sound that could break reality itself, the sound of God's breath moving through the darkness. Creation itself trembled, the chains hummed, and the abyss for a single moment became aware of its maker again. But this was not judgment returning. Judgment had already been done. This was something older, deeper, something even angels cannot comprehend. It was remembrance. Because even in his wrath, God had never forgotten what he had made. He had not abandoned memory. He had not erased what once was called beautiful. The fallen spirit lifted what was left of his awareness, and though he could not see, he knew. The presence was there, the same presence that once filled the heavens with song, the same presence that once gave him his name, his purpose, his wings. And in that moment, something passed between the Creator and the creation that had betrayed him. Something without words, something beyond comprehension. Heaven looked down upon that single exchange, and for the first time, the angels realized. God's sovereignty is not chained to time. His mercy does not obey the rules of righteousness as they understand it. He speaks not because the fallen deserve it, but because he can. For when God speaks, it is not always to command. Sometimes it is to remember. That day the abyss itself was silent. The other fallen spirits did not stir. They did not dare. For they knew that no being, no soul, no power could make the Almighty speak unless he chose to. And yet he had chosen this. The voice that formed stars was now touching what was damned. And the reason? Not forgiveness, not pity, but purpose. Because even in rebellion, the fallen still served a divine role, to prove the contrast between light and darkness, obedience and pride, grace and ruin. The existence of the damned made redemption meaningful. The memory of their fall gave heaven a reason to extend grace to man. So God's voice in that pit was not a restoration. It was a reminder that nothing, not even rebellion, escapes his plan. When the whisper faded, the abyss fell silent again. But something had changed. The chains did not loosen, yet the weight of eternity felt different, as though the fallen now carried a spark of remembrance inside their ruin. That day was recorded nowhere in Scripture, yet its echo is felt throughout it. Because after God spoke to a demon, mercy began to echo louder in heaven. And somewhere in the mind of creation, an ancient truth was sealed, that God's sovereignty is not bound by who is worthy to hear him, only by his will to speak. The watchers remained in darkness, yet heaven was never the same again. The angels knew that even in damnation, God's presence could reach. Even in silence, his remembrance could stir. And that knowledge became the foundation of divine compassion, the kind that would one day send his Son into the world. For the God who once spoke to a demon would later walk among sinners. The same voice that entered the pit would one day whisper to the broken, the unworthy, the lost, not in wrath, but in love. And so it was written not in any book of man, but upon the fabric of creation, that no darkness is so complete that God cannot speak into it, and no fall is so deep that heaven cannot remember it. Long after the abyss swallowed the last echo of that divine whisper, time continued to move, slow, relentless, and sacred. The stars took their place again in the heavens. The earth found its rhythm beneath the weight of sin and redemption. Prophets rose, kings fell, and generations passed, each unaware that somewhere beyond their understanding, a single moment in the depths of eternity had changed everything. The day God spoke to a demon had not ended in that pit. It had only begun there. For what God speaks once, he speaks forever. His words do not die in the air. They ripple through creation, binding heaven, hell, and the hearts of men in unseen harmony. From that moment on, a strange, unseen current began to flow through time, something that even the angels did not fully grasp. A quiet force that reached into the conscience of man, whispering of mercy that seemed too vast to belong to earth. The prophets could feel it when they spoke of grace. David sensed it when he cried, "If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there." Because long before David ever spoke those words, God had already proven them true. The voice that had spoken to the fallen now lingered like wind through the ages, searching for those who had also fallen, not from heaven, but from grace. And when the fullness of time came, that same voice would no longer thunder from the skies, but speak softly through human breath. It would be heard again in the voice of a carpenter's son, standing among the broken, touching the untouchable, forgiving the unforgivable. Every miracle, every word, every tear he shed carried an echo from that ancient day when heaven first remembered the fallen, because the love that dared to speak to a demon would one day dare to die for mankind. The angels understood it too late. They had once seen God's justice. Now they were witnessing his heart. What they thought was a mystery of wrath had always been a prophecy of mercy. That single conversation in the abyss had been a seed, planted deep within eternity, waiting for its season to bloom on earth. And when Christ hung upon the cross, that seed blossomed. For in that moment, the voice that spoke light into darkness, that spoke to the fallen, that spoke existence into being, now cried, "It is finished." Heaven trembled again, not in wrath this time, but in awe, because the same God who had once reached into the pit was now reaching into death itself and still speaking, still remembering, still redeeming. The voice had never stopped. It only changed where it was heard. It spoke to Lucifer once, to remind him that light cannot be destroyed. It spoke to the prophets, to remind them that truth cannot be silenced. It spoke through Christ, to remind the world that love cannot be killed. And even now that voice still moves, quietly, invisibly, through the ruins of hearts and the shadows of souls. It does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in guilt, in longing, in tears. Sometimes it sounds like memory, sometimes like conscience, sometimes like hope. But for those who listen closely, they will know it is the same voice that spoke before time began, the same voice that reached into darkness and dared to speak to what was lost, the same voice that remembered what heaven had once loved. That is why no soul is ever too far gone, no past too corrupted, no fall too deep, because somewhere in the silence, God still speaks, not to condemn, but to call home what was once His. And that, my friends, is the mystery buried beneath creation. The day God spoke to a demon was not the story of damnation. It was the beginning of redemption, because love never forgets what it created, and heaven never stops remembering the fallen.